Thanks so much for joining us today. Can you give us an overview of the public policy survey?
Absolutely. So the School of Public Service at Boise State, we used to do this survey for a while, a couple decades ago, and then we sort of restarted it about 6 years ago. And this survey is a statewide survey of Idaho, and it is designed to capture the preferences and opinions of Idahoans. So what we do is we recruit a sample of 1,000 Idahoans, and we do it through a couple of different means. We do it over the phone, we do it via email, and we do it via text message, kind of trying to get over the hurdles of people not answering their phones and recruit people from a diverse array of different kinds of contacts. And so what we do is we've got a sample of 1,000 people that really does pretty nicely look like the state of Idaho. It is geographically representative of the state. It looks about like the state in terms of age. And really importantly for our purposes, I think it's pretty close to what the state would look like on measures of partisanship, right? So we have a sample where it's a majority Republican sample, and that's one concern in surveys out there today is that surveys just aren't quite getting enough Republicans. But we feel pretty good about this sample representing all Idahoans over the age of 18. That's kind of the group we're trying to speak to.
So, when it comes to that group of Idahoans, broadly speaking, what are the policy priorities?
So it's really interesting. We've been asking this policy priority question now for the last 6 years, and we keep seeing a very, very consistent message from Idahoans. The first thing that always is almost always at the top of our list is education. So year over year, people say, you know, the number one thing for us, or the thing we are most interested in seeing addressed, is education. Now, it doesn't mean we know what exactly they want to happen with education, but that issue is consistently at the top of the list, along with jobs in the economy. And this year was no different. So we've just seen this very, very consistent message from Idahoans.
Before we get into specifics and the breakdown, I'm really curious about the COVID specific questions that you asked this year. When it comes to the pandemic, what's on Idahoans' minds?
You know, it's really interesting. So we asked a whole bunch of different questions about people's personal experiences with the virus. So have you had it? How many people do you know that have had it? Things like that. We also asked, you know, what are your biggest concerns? Because the pandemic is impacting so many different parts of people's lives. And one thing that we found was that Idahoans put impacts on the economy actually as the most frequently identified concern. Also near the top of the list are concerns about how the pandemic is impacting the education of Idaho's children. So actually, when we provide those different options, we see the third place option is the public health concerns about sickness. So Idahoans appear to be primarily concerned with economic impacts as it relates to the pandemic.
And there were partisan splits in those concerns too, which isn't surprising looking at the nationwide discussion.
Exactly right. And so that's one of the predominant themes, both in the COVID questions, but really throughout the survey, is the most important thing you need to know about somebody if you want to predict what they think is their partisanship. So Republicans overwhelmingly are in the concern about the economy, as well as the education of Idaho's children. Democrats much more likely to say that their primary concern was more in the public health sphere, things relating to sickness, et cetera.
Let's talk about mask mandates. That was one of the questions that people were asked, and it was pretty evenly split, but people felt very strongly about the question.
Exactly right. And I think this is another sort of sign of our highly partisan time. So we actually asked two different questions. The first was just kind of a general, what do you think about the idea of a statewide mask mandate? When we ask it that way, we see a majority of Idahoans support the idea of a statewide mask mandate. Democrats almost universally support it. Republicans were more divided. Actually, Republicans were slightly opposed. When we ask a version of the question saying, what do you think about a statewide mask mandate where not wearing a mask is enforceable by a fine, we see opinions now become very sharply divided in the state. Essentially, they're within our margin of error, and we can't say if more Idahoans support or oppose a mask mandate with an enforcement provision.
People were fairly divided on vaccines too.
They were. And so I think I should give some context to the vaccine question. Our survey was in the field at the very end of November and very beginning of December. So at this point in time, we had trial results for our two primary vaccines had been released. So people knew they were effective. but they had not yet been approved by the FDA. People had not yet begun getting shots. So that was the world people were living in when we asked them this question. But what we found was about 55% of Idahoans said they would probably or definitely get the vaccine, with 38% saying they would probably or definitely not get the vaccine. So that's a number that's probably going to present a challenge to public health officials as they try to get the percentage in the state to be high enough to where we can really see cases fall off.
But as you acknowledged, those questions were asked in the infancy of vaccine rollout. And so if you ask that question now, and I realize I'm asking you to speculate, but do you think that those no's would be a little bit more soft, or more people would be willing to?
That's a great question. So we have seen since early December some increases in willingness to get vaccinated if we look at national polling data. And that's kind of the best thing we can do to compare, is to say, well, what's happened nationwide? And there is a suggestion that nationwide we have seen that. And in talking with people around the state of Idaho about these results, I think the hope is that as the vaccine rollout accelerates, as people personally know others who have gotten the vaccine and they've been fine, and then they're not getting sick, that hopefully that willingness to get vaccinated will increase. But yeah, so my guess is today we would probably see slightly more optimistic numbers on this question, but there probably is still a fair amount of resistance. We're showing about 27% of the state saying they definitely would not get a vaccine. So that's some pretty hard resistance.
Let's get back to legislative policy. When you asked this, Idaho was seeing a sizable budget surplus, and since then it's only grown. What were folks' thoughts on what to do with that budget surplus?
Yeah, so we presented folks with a question basically saying, and like you mentioned, at this point in time, we were thinking a slightly smaller surplus than we're actually expecting now. What do you think we should do with this money? And the state is somewhat divided on this. The most common response was tax relief. So turning some of this money back to the people via tax cuts in some format. But a sizable number of Idahoans, in the low 30% range, said their priority would be investing in critical state services, whether it's education or transportation, something along those lines. So there's kind of this tension in public opinion in Idaho where both tax cuts and investment in critical services are both fairly popular amongst the public.
When you asked the question, was it an either or was there a chance for respondents to say, you know what, we have enough money, we can invest and return some to taxpayers?
It's a great question. So the way we presented it was, what do you think is your top priority? So we had a choose one of them. You're right, the actual nature of the policy discussion, and if you look at the governor's budget proposals and things like this, is some mixture of these things. We avoid that in the survey simply because things can get complicated on the question delivery end of things when we start having people rank order choices. But you're absolutely right that with both being popular, it's likely that there's some support for a mixture of the two, kind of like what you've seen in the governor's budget.
When it comes to respondents who said that they thought that tax relief should be the top priority, what were the types of tax cuts that they were interested in?
Yeah, so we asked a question that said, okay, so if we were to do tax relief, is there a kind of tax you would be most interested in seeing reduced? And really what we see is income tax being the most popular, but property tax is also being high on the list. Sales tax quite a bit down the list. So reducing sales tax appears to be the least popular option of those three. But I would put the income and property taxes kind of in a similar realm in terms of their popularity.
Is grocery tax included under the sales tax umbrella?
So, from a policy perspective, I would say yes, it is. We actually asked a question specifically about the grocery tax a few years back, and we did see quite a bit of support for reducing that specific tax. For this one, we just chose to leave it a little bit more open-ended and just keep things simple in terms of income, property, and sales.
When it comes to education, how do Idahoans see the quality of K through 12 schools?
It's really interesting. So we've been asking that question for the past 5 years now. It's sort of the most common response we see is that the quality of education in the state is fair. sizable number do say good. We do also have about 20 to 25% pretty consistently who say the quality in the state as a whole is poor. And very few say excellent. Around 5% say excellent. And those are fairly consistent numbers over time. So, my interpretation of that is that Idahoans have kind of a middling perception of the quality of education, and maybe they think there's room for improvement. The good news is that if you shift down and you ask, what about the schools in your specific area? Maybe schools that people actually have experience with, the perceptions do get better. So when we ask that question, we see that the percent who say they think school quality is good increases, the percent who say excellent increases. And I also want to point out that if we look specifically at parents who have children in school, of school age, their perceptions tend to be of higher quality than people who do not have children in school. So the big picture is one where there's room for improvement, but there are some silver linings under the surface of that overarching perception.
All right, Professor Jeffrey Lyons, thanks so much for joining us today.
Hey, thanks so much for having me. I appreciate it.